Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. This week's guest is return guest Eliot Peper, who joined us in episode 47 to talk about science fiction as scenario planning, a kind of apology or argument for the entire field. This week we're going to get into his writing specifically, and even more specifically, his book Breach, the third and final volume of his analog series, which explores the social, psychological, political consequences of the way that our lives online subject us to subliminal influence by actors with both our best and worst interests in mind. And the individual becomes a sort of contested territory in an age of algorithmically curated news, AI-assisted demographic targeting, and unprecedentedly powerful information technology companies whose influence challenges the power of the state and forces us into a reconsideration of our established systems of governance in the 21st century. This is about a book that was released a couple weeks ago, but the timing is impeccable given this week's news on the Department of Justice preparing their antitrust probe into Google, people asking questions about whether it's desirable or even possible to break up Facebook into a number of smaller companies. This is definitely a set of questions very much alive in the minds of Americans and people around the world. So it seems like a good time to consider once again how our technologically mediated environments shape the way that we think about and act upon these issues. But before we get into it, I just want to give a shout out to this week's new Patreon supporters, Leaf Early and Moody Al-Kamash. In addition to the 145 other Patreon supporters for this show, thank you all so much for getting me that much closer to this year's goal of 200 patrons. I really hope you enjoy being a part of the Sci-Fi Book Club and getting access to all of the exclusive and early content that I publish to Patreon. Our next book club sometime in July will be for Cixin Liu's Three Body Problem. So if you're interested, hop on in, and you can also retroactively enjoy our discussions from Peter Watts's Blind Sight and Diana Slattery's Xenolinguistics. Also, deep thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate and review this show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to be listening to it. I know that this program is super niche, but you would be amazed at how big this niche really is, how many more people we can fold into this wonderful conversation, how many new kindred spirits you have yet to meet who found Future Fossils from your podcast review. So thanks in advance if you are about to review this show. It's hugely appreciated by all of those future unborn archaeologists who could not have found it otherwise. And lastly, stay tuned for a special additional episode this week from my friend Kevin Woolmut, who is reading two excellent essays about the next 10 billion years. Stay tuned in your podcast feed for that bonus episode. And with that, thank you all so much for listening, and enjoy this wonderful conversation with Eliot Peper, author of Breach. You probably are conserving bandwidth here, so I could kill the video.
Yeah, we're unfortunately the Bay Area does not live up to its reputation as a sort of hub of the internet by providing absolutely terrible bandwidth to most of the neighborhoods. So here in Oakland, we have pretty bad connection. So if I do video, you're going to get a lot of breaks in the recording.
Yeah, I had Eric Davis on a while back, and we were joking about how the tech nexus is increasingly inimical to human existence. It's like who's the 5G really for? It's for robots, you know. But at any rate,
right? Yeah, no, that's not right.
Well, man, I'm really glad to have you back on the show. And
I'm glad to be here.
thanks. And last time we spoke sort of vaguely about the role of speculative fiction authors in forecasting and their value to enterprise, which I know is like, you're coming out of that VC world. But given that you just finished this trilogy of books that are, as they say, sort of frighteningly plausible in the near term, I think it makes more sense to talk today about some of the big ideas in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about whatever you think will be of most interest to listeners. So I'll go wherever you lead me.
Well, right on. So so in this analog trilogy, that your final book, Breach, is coming out in May, and this arc is an arc about globe encircling tech monopolies and the revolutionary activists who oppose and sometimes penetrate and exist within them. And I'm curious what are the sort of like prime concerns here? Like what are the big questions that you are trying to raise through this work, and you're trying to enter into the conversation? Because it's clear that in certain ways this is now a much larger part of the public conversation than it was when you started writing these books.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I like what you said when you said what are some of the questions you want people to think about when reading these books, because I actually think that one of the most fun things for me as a novelist about writing fiction is that it is very much about questions more than answers, right? So when I'm working on a new book, I always try to find contradiction. I try to seek out questions that don't have clear answers, because that messy middle, that nuance, is where the interesting parts are, right? Like if the answer is obvious, I don't need to write a book about it. And so that's actually where I often start. And I think that, in terms of thinking about how technology impacts the future extrapolated in the analog series, it can be helpful to think about the past. So, when the printing press was invented, it fundamentally changed human information technology, right? Instead of every manuscript needing to be copied out by hand, you could suddenly print manuscripts, print perfect copies or nearly perfect copies for very, very cheap, which totally changed the written word from being this unbelievably expensive luxury enjoyed mostly by monks and a privileged few, to something that was much more democratic and just became sort of like a part of how the world worked. And by becoming part of power structures, one of the sort of things that many people don't realize about the printing press is how it very much was one of the things that set off the 100 Years' War, the church wars, basically, in Europe, because you suddenly were able to not just, like initially the whole goal with the printing press was to be able to distribute Bibles. That's what people wanted to do with it. But the minute that you could distribute Bibles, you could also distribute anything else, right? Like anything else that you wrote down. And I don't think we ever would have had, the Inquisition without the printing press, because being able to distribute the written word in the way that it allowed people to do also allowed people with really extreme opinions and really violent worldviews to spread their ideas in the, late Middle Age or, Renaissance era of virality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you could have an idea like that spread across many different communities without being dramatically changed in the interim, and also without being sort of adopted to local context or moderated by anyone in between, because once you write something down, you can pass it around. And so I think that, technology is one of the prime forces that shifts what human society looks like across history. And you can't understand history without understanding the history of technology. And I think that right now we are in the midst of yet another transition, right? I mean, if you look at some of the really fascinating pieces of technology that have dramatically shifted how our world works compared to generations that came before, I mean, I can name a few. I mean, obviously the printing press is one of them. Certainly writing itself was one of them, a much older one. Plumbing and sanitation is a huge one that we never think about, right? Yeah. But it's sort of invisible to us. It's under the asphalt, and yet it has completely transformed the cities. Like cities in the modern sense couldn't exist without modern sanitation and sewer systems. So it literally shaped the world that most people live in. If you live in an urban area. Birth control and contraception has also dramatically changed the world, and how we live our lives compared to not very long ago. Same with antibiotics, same with electricity, same with the Green Revolution, with, basically the invention of industrialized agriculture. All of these things have dramatically shifted how the world works, and in doing so, they challenge traditional institutions, because institutions, by their very nature, are run by people in power. And people in power hold their power based on the status quo, right? Like, that's how the world works. Like, you write, like, Congress in the US right now, like, Congress writes laws based on what's going on in the country, not what might be going on 10 years from now, right? Mm-hmm. So lawmaking or policymaking is largely a reactionary measure to just sort of, okay, we see that there's a problem and we want to try to address it, right? And so right now we are in the process of basically digitizing reality, right? We have computers and phones and wireless networks and the internet are connecting the world ever more tightly together and digitizing the world ever more effectively. And so what that's doing is that's creating this sort of ubiquitous digital shadow of the physical world that we all live in. And in the analog book, that is played out further and called the feed, right? To sort of like reference that digital reality that runs in parallel to our physical one. Even today, like without the advances that these books take for granted, the internet and computers and computer networking are already challenging many of our traditional institutions, right? Like there are a bunch of easy examples, like the Treaty of Westphalia, which was signed a few hundred years ago in Western Europe, basically created the modern conception of the nation state, what we think of as a country, like what it means to have a central government and what the central government is supposed to do, and the social contract that's sort of set up with citizens. Now, like, it's starting to get awkward because now we have all of these sort of nation states that were designed to be containers for pretty self-contained national economies, right? And like self-contained national life. But today, trade is completely global. Money is completely global. Information is now completely global. Like, you can just iMessage with someone on the other side of the earth and it's free, right? Like, I mean, as long as you have data access. I mean, it's wild. So the realities of our lives have changed a lot. Like the way that the economy functions, the way that our lives function is super different than when they wrote the Treaty of Westphalia. And we haven't updated what it means to be a nation state sufficiently since then, right? So I think that, right now we're in one of those interesting tipping points, right? Just like when the printing press came around, because it's messy. We actually haven't figured out the new kinds of societies that we want to build, given the new reality we've already invented. And that's really, sort of, I think, the theme that underlines all three books.
So there's something that I see here that in the pattern you're describing, which is this tension between the erasure of political borders, the economic coupling of different industries and different regions. I'm sure you've seen that. Was it Parag Khanna's map of the United States redrawn according to infrastructure? Where you see
I haven't seen that, but that sounds fascinating.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's like Western Missouri belongs to Kansas, Eastern Missouri belongs to Illinois. North California and South California are their own political blocks, and this is the reality we live in. But we're still sort of living according to like people driving around here in Santa Fe with these bumper stickers that are like kind of conservative stubbornness, being like, New Mexico is part of the United States, it's not its own country, and but on the other hand, to call to the second book, Borderless, but on the other hand, the feed is sort of a symptom of the way that this hyperconnectivity creates these new complex overlapping borders with filter bubbles. And so when I look at this stuff, I'm thinking at it from an evolutionary zoom out here at the emergence of complex life from simple bacterial life and the enclosure of these different bacteria into this new macro system, the nucleated cell, and how each of those different bacteria became in some way more specialized, became more partial or fragmentary, and reproductively dependent on the new system-wide thing that they were all participating in. And so, I'm curious, how do you think about this? Not just looking at it as an evolution of technology thing, but as a deep time process that is driven by these sort of thermodynamic cycles where a new macro system emerges and then all of its parts sort of have to redefine themselves, and this particular thing, especially in relationship to the self and to psychology, which are both issues that you explore in these books.
So I think that an interesting approach to answering that question is to think about the current sort of discussion of AI in the news, right? So if you read, if you read a Wired article or something that's about AI, it's sort of like AI is like the new sexy thing everybody wants in their PowerPoints, right? So every company is talking about how they're using AI and all of this different stuff. And I think that most of both the enthusiasm and detraction of the conversation around AI a lot of it's really misguided. I mean, in one sense, AI is just an approach to software programming. Like machine learning is basically statistical programming. It's amazing. It can do really, really cool things. Like it makes Google Translate work really, really well, right? You can solve great problems with it, big problems with it. And I think that it will wind up, and technologies that we use in everyday life, in a similar way to how the internet has changed things. However, it's not like AI is not any more conscious than any other computer program or any other tool we've ever made, right? So if you think about, if you actually take a look at the code behind a piece of, TensorFlow, like Google's machine learning platform, it's code. There's no there. And a lot of the hand waving around AI is, I think, sort of self-defeating. But I think that the interesting part is not at all that like somebody's piece of software is going to just magically cross this infinite gulf to consciousness. What's actually interesting is if you think about the entire internet, not just Google or something like that, but like the whole internet. If you think about the internet as if it is already an AI, right? So if you think about the internet as an AI, you could think about it has these different limbs or organs, just like we have, you know, a liver and a stomach and a brain, right? Like Google is sort of like in some ways the brain, right? It's almost like helping to organize all of the digital information in ways that make that information both human and machine readable, right? You have Google Maps, cars, and satellites just sucking in data and imagery of the physical world around it to then feed this enormous brain, right? You have Facebook and sort of the social networks that are allowing us to map our own relationships on computers, right? Like we are the ones posting everything in Instagram and like, you know, sending all these texts all the time, right? Like, you know, like most of our economy basically runs on email, right? What do most people do? Like most white collar jobs are basically people sending emails to each other with occasional and exceptional in-person meetings and little bits of focused creative work scattered throughout, right? Like that's sort of most jobs, at least in the US. And you have cameras and drones and Alexa and phones in everyone's pocket everywhere. Like we're all sort of basically cyborgs. We just have an external digital limb ourselves that usually follows us around in a pocket or a purse, right? And all of those objects have recording devices in them and are collecting data all the time and are being tracked all the time. And that allows us to then make them better and make the services we use them with better. And it also allows for more nefarious things. And then you think about all the actual physical infrastructure, all the fiber lines that we've buried beneath the ground, all the satellites we've thrown up into orbit, all the wireless signals that permeate the air around us, right? I mean, like, who's working for who here? Right? Like, you know, there's a great argument that sort of like, you know, grass and raccoons and dogs and cats, I mean, are they the big winners in evolution? Because basically, for whatever reason, they've convinced humans, or humans have decided, not clear which, that, you know, that we should spend a significant amount of our resources as the sort of dominant species on Earth right now to like make them super happy, right? Like that's why we all take care of our lawns and do things like that. That's sort of ridiculous, right? In a way, grass is the big winner. It certainly covers a lot more territory than it ever did before we started cultivating lawns just for fun, right? So there's this interesting relationship with digital technology as well. So, I mean, if you start thinking about the entire internet as an AI, then Google is not a company that is building what could be and in the future some kind of AI program. Rather, Google and its status as like a corporation, all of the sort of corporate hierarchies that exist within it, and all of the people employed there working on teams there are actually just one part of this vast AI, right? So that means that our legal system is just another algorithm within it, right? Like all of those things start to cascade. So from that perspective, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that to the extent that we stitch civilization together ever more tightly, we become ever more interdependent. Just like the cells in my liver are alive in their own right, but also depend on the cells in my brain to do things, and vice versa.
Do you think that the cells in your liver are trying to stage a coup and like take down the brain. Because this is the thing that, you know, like that puzzles me all the time, is that I feel like that scale free view that you're presenting here is more and more accessible, almost passe in certain circles. Like people, that Powers of 10 video from the 70s, people are starting to find a modern science inflected language anyway for understanding our place in this greater system, this order. And
sure,
you know,
sure.
whether people, you know, lean on Google being, you know, a sentient thing, or whether people lean on, you know, Gaia theory. Sure. But the thing about it, though, is that as these new layers of emergent order appear in the fossil record, they're made out of these things that have lost the kind of, you know, interdependence has this, like, you know, warm fuzzy thing, but it also suggests that, like, there's no turning back the clock, that we're living in a more energetically efficient world, a more convenient world, like the whole evolutionary process tilting towards convenience in this, you know, free energy minimization kind of sense. And so, you know, we have this, you know, it feels to me that the kind of rebellion against, I mean, I am not, like, you know, a techno-optimist booster of progress here, but it does seem as though we are on a runaway train, and attempts to stop the train are only causing more damage and confusion. And yet we're moving into a space that, like you said at the beginning of this, is making us deeply uncomfortable, because it's challenging all of our institutions, including the institution of the self as an individual, as like a discrete thing. And that there's this sense in which your books thoroughly explore the sort of Jaron Lanier inversion, where he's pointing out that that these social networks turn us into the operant edge nodes of this network, and that what we think of as our own ideas and desires they're not generated internally. And then, of course, also, you know, Breach ends with this sort of a beautiful statement about the nature of the self as a composite and plural thing. And I'm really curious how you, like, what kind of, I mean, if you want to keep it on the questions rather than the answers, what kind of questions do you think are helpful orienting questions as we move into this, like, intensely psychedelic and bizarre space where where the person reading the book is actually, you know, just this node, and it seems as though our human identity is, like you said in you interviewed Nick Harkaway for the LA Review of Books, and in that conversation, you know, talking about the more we learn about information technology and brain science, we realize that this whole thought about how we come to decisions and how we understand the so-called reality is, like, deeply, deeply interrogated. So, like, where do you, like, what kind of orientation do you hope for people here? Like, where do you think the most useful questions are in this sort of mess of, like, the end of the modern self?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not a big believer in self as as like unitary self as an idea. I think that we are all made up of many selves, right? Like when we have these competing elements within us, and that part of what it means to be human is to try to stitch those together into some kind of coherent narrative. And we are doing that on the fly all the time. Like, memory is synthetic, right? We spend most of our time either doing things in the moment, like being aware and doing something, or synthesizing memory, or speculating about the future, right? It's sort of like that's what's going on in our heads constantly. And I think that part of what it means to be human is to stitch together all of these sort of like disparate elements into one story that we tell ourselves about ourselves that is our identity, right? Now, so I think that, you know, if you look at each of us, if you could have a window into my mind, you would see not one person, but sort of like many different elements that are always sort of merging and sort of breaking apart and coming back together in new ways. Now, when you take that up a level, I also think that we only really exist, sort of like quantum entanglement, like we only exist in relation to each other. So I think that trying to conceptualize what it means to be a self in the absence of context is sort of meaningless to me, or I don't know what to do with that. And so I think that because of that, we exist because of each other and in relation to each other, which means that you're right. Like, as the world changes, the circumstances we are born into, like, we have to deal with that. Like, we don't have a choice to be like, you know what, I'm going to opt out, right? I'm going to opt out of reality, or I'm going to opt out of history, right? No, like, doesn't matter how much you don't like it. Like, if you don't like it, like, do something to make it different, right? And I think that that is just the only choice we have, or it's not even a choice. Like, no matter what happens, you will be forced to deal with that. So you can either be bitter about it or you can embrace it. And I prefer to embrace it. But there are a lot of people who are intimidated, understandably, by the weight of the circumstances they're born into, right? So in my mind, I mean, like, it's sort of funny. I mean, there are certainly dark elements in my books, but I definitely think of myself as an optimist. And I think of the futures and the journeys that these books go on as fundamentally optimistic in the sense that although the things we've built enable all sorts of new problems, the only way we've ever dealt with problems is to try to solve them, right? So, I think that yes, for example, New York City streets were filling up with manure at the end of the 19th century, and it got so bad that they called all the urban planners in the world together, or many of the leading urban planners at the time, to try to figure out, what are we going to do? We have these cities that are filling up with horse manure, which spreads disease, and it's just disgusting. So, what can we solve this problem with? And this meeting of the sort of like the best urban planners in the world came to the conclusion that cities were over, and that basically everyone should move to the countryside, because there was no way to get around the fact that horses poop and horses are how you get around. So you're screwed, right? Like, basically you can't have cities that go beyond a certain size or density because they'll just drown in horse manure.
It was a singularity.
Exactly. No, it's exactly right. It was like the singularity of the end of the 19th century, right? And then what happened? Like, 20 years later, everyone was using cars, and this problem had been totally forgotten. It was just like, oh, yeah, we barely even remember that was an issue, right? And what happened because of cars? Well, now we've pumped enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to completely change the Earth system. And now we're, it's like, oh shit, right? Now we're dealing with that because we solved the manure problem, right? So I think that there's a human tendency to want an end game. Like and I think that desire for resolution is part of what makes certain sort of apocalyptic religious scenarios appealing, right? Because it's like, well, the rapture, right? Or, well, whatever, choose your religion, like, there's this, that we're going to reach this ultimate point when everything, the singularity, right? We're going to reach this point where just like everything radically changes and sort of we get to Judgment Day in a sense. And I think that that's also part of what makes narrative itself appealing, right? We have like stories that have like a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Oh, thank
right?
God, there's an end. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like, that wrap everything up. And when you listen to a song, it's the same thing. That feeling of when you're listening to music and, the song is going and going. And even if you've never heard the song in your life before, if I paused it right in the middle, you would be able to hum the note that was supposed to come next, right? Because we just have this intuition for, okay, we need to like resolve that. We need to come back to that note, right? We have to resolve this tension. And I think that is a really interesting psychological dynamic within our own mind, but I don't think it reflects much about the nature of the reality we live in. And so when I look at issues like manure or climate change, they are huge issues, and I think that they really deserve our attention. But because, like you said, we can't turn back the clock, it means that our way forward is clear. Like, we actually have to fix this stuff, and we have to figure out a way to fix this stuff. And like, if we can't figure out how to fix it, given our current way of thinking, we need to change our way of thinking so we can fix it, right? So that's how I look at the world. And I think that sort of comes through in the book, So I think that, maybe that's the best answer I can give to your question. It's just that, life is complicated, and like, you shouldn't assume, as some in Silicon Valley do, that you are going to create such a clever solution that you will anticipate every problem. No, right? You won't. Like, you're going to fail at that. Your solution is going to create new problems. And the best way to deal with that knowingly is to try to keep an open mind, try to maintain your beginner's mind, maintain your state of awareness about the world, and try to continually challenge your own assumptions.
That's a good one, because I was just watching a talk by Jeff West, the former president of the Santa Fe Institute. He was talking about scaling laws in cities. I'm sure you may have seen his TED talk on the surprising math behind cities. He talks about as a city grows, the infrastructure grows at less than, like, as it doubles, the infrastructure grows less than a doubling, because there's efficiency in the network. But then the same network properties create a superlinear expansion of all of these other networked things, like crime and disease and patents and all of this other stuff. And he made this point in this talk, not the TED talk, but this other one, where he was talking about how as these things, as systems like a city grow, the pace of that network, due to this exponential innovation, is itself, the delta of that pace is itself exponential. And so we're creating exponentially more problems, and we're getting to the end of these innovation cycles where we hit this point. He talks in mathematical terms as a finite time singularity, where it's either radical innovation or collapse. And because each radical innovation only bootstraps this ratcheting process, rather than a singularity, we're coming up on sort of an accelerating queue of many singularities. And that there's basically like this, if you can't really call it an end game, like in your book, which, it ends in a sort of a beautiful beginning, the dawn of a new thing, that we get to this point where and Kevin Kelly has spoken to this quite a bit as well, that we're at a process of constantly beginning, and yet it's every new beginning is in a system that is more complex, more multifaceted, more difficult for us individually or collectively to understand or affect any kind of predictable change on. So, I mean, I don't know where I'm going with that. Just that it seems like we're still, it seems as though there's this paradox, which is that the solutions are opening us up into deeper questions, and that your sort of preference or emphasis on the question is almost like an evolutionary adaptation to an age we can't understand. Because, you've got the massive conglomerate in your books, the Commonwealth, sort of, Google-esque stand-in. The problem that it seems like people are stuck on these days is that we regard these massive institutions in some sense as individuals. I mean, maybe they are in a vast evolutionary way, but operating from within them, as a user of the feed, then it's like being inside the brain and trying to affect the massive changes in neurons. It seems like we're thinking about this completely wrong. And I mean, are you is this the kind of thing that keeps you up at night also? I don't know.
I mean, so I would say, it's sort of fascinating, right? Like I think that Kevin, and I'm not sure this guy's name, Jeff, you said?
Yeah, Jeff.
Are both right. I mean, like you see these really fascinating sort of like data points of acceleration, right? That you can have these sort of positive feedback loops that just make things go and go in new and strange directions. And so that can feel disorienting because it can feel impossible to make sense of a world that is changing so fast. At the same time, if I was living 10,000 years ago in Northern California, where I live today, I mean, there was like almost everything in the world, or not everything, but a huge amount of what happened to me was controlled by factors I totally had no way to understand and that were fundamentally beyond my control, right? Like, you have a baby and it dies 2 years old and you have no idea. You're just like, well, like either we got unlucky or like some God must have been pissed at us, right? Or whatever, right? Like you would we'd come up with ways to help us live through that pain. But most of our explanations were not, did not reflect what we now know of how the world works, right? Of like germs, for example. Right? So I think that the feelings we have today may not be as singular as we imagine them to be, because while we are creating all of these new complex systems and we have these new ways to influence the world that are unprecedented, right? Like we have enormous power. Our tools have given us enormous power, and that power has consequences. And at the same time, our tools have also made the universe more legible to us, right? Like we've actually figured out how to heal your 2-year-old who would otherwise die, right? Like we've actually figured out how to sanitize a wound. We've actually figured out that it's important to drink clean water, right? There are tons of things that we've figured out that would have completely felt beyond the veil, right? To someone from 99% of human history. So, I think that there's a balance here between, yes, we are living in an age of acceleration, absolutely. And yet we have always been confronted by a universe that defies our limited ability to make sense of it, right? And as a curious person in a curious species, right? Like I feel like curiosity is one of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens, right? Hey, let's try it. Like I want to press the red button, right? I think that's like a big piece of where our tool making sort of, skills have come from, is that curiosity about the world. I think that part of that is driven by this internal emotional state of being on the verge, like this vertiginous feeling that we almost, but not quite, can wrap our minds around what's really going on. And that if we only take that further step, we'll get there, right? And so I think that is part of what fuels, that feeling is part of what fuels our curiosity, or maybe that is what curiosity means. But I also think that, like hunger, that feeling can never be permanently satiated, right? So we can discover quantum mechanics, but then we suddenly realize shortly thereafter that there are more layers, right? Like that the universe keeps going, right? Like at every scale, right? So that doesn't mean that we should stop trying to make sense of the universe and our own existence and experience within it. But it does mean that we might be able to sleep easier at night, right? Because if you truly are on the brink of such a world and self-transforming insight, maybe you wouldn't be able to sleep because you'd know if only you could get there, that would happen. But if you realize that maybe feeling on the brink of insight is in fact core to the human condition, then it means you can enjoy it, right? Like you can enjoy that feeling of curiosity, just like a child might enjoy the anticipation of Christmas morning. Rather than just wanting to be there, actually enjoying the feeling of anticipation. It's the same as enjoying the feeling of hunger, knowing that you're about to have an amazing meal that you cook at home, right? Rather than just being like, I'm so upset because I'm hungry, right? Like, and I think that,
or enjoying the process of discovering who is influencing you through the digital network in which you're permanently embedded. There's like, that's one of the sort of fun things about your writing, is that it really triggers this contemporary, what Doug Rushkoff called fractal noia, the eruption of conspiracy theory in this kind of a space where that you're being messed with, but it's like, if we can twist that, like you're saying, and we can turn it around and make it more of a perennial human concern, then it's about this sort of continuous story of the ongoing revelation of all of the ways that we are deeply interconnected to all of this stuff. It doesn't sound quite so bad. It's like metanoia instead of paranoia.
I mean, like, here, so turn that fractal noia or whatever, that's a great term, on its head, right? So like, okay, so I suspect that people are trying to manipulate me via social media, right? Like the simple example, right? So like filter bubbles and all that jazz. Well, what does that really mean? Let's walk through what that really means. It means that like there's another person in the world who disagrees with me, right? So they clearly, if we already agree with each other, they wouldn't need to manipulate me. So what they're doing is they disagree with me and they're trying to trick me into agreeing with them, right? So they're being like a jerk, right? Like they're being intellectually dishonest by trying to trick me into sharing their worldview, right? Now, is that new? Like, hell no. Like, people have been trying to trick each other for as long as there have been people, right? Like, we've had manipulating assholes since the beginning of time. It's just that now those people have access to tools that allow them to try to trick people who are not physically in the room with them, right? Which they used to, that was the old barrier to tricking people. But if you're tricking people remotely, like if you deal with someone in the same room as you and they're trying to trick you or trying to trick others and you're aware of their trickery, what do? Well, you try to expose them and tell the truth, right? So you try to say, hey, stop trying to trick me, or hey, this guy's trying to trick you and here's why, or hey, we just ignore that guy completely and here's my point of view that you should look at, and I'm not trying to trick you, I'm being honest about it, right? So you should listen to me instead. We still only have the time we're given. We're just spending more of it online, so we're spending more time interacting with people remotely than we used to interacting only with people right around us. But it's not like there's more time for these tricksters to take from us. It's just that we're interacting with a different group of people. So what does it mean that we can interact with people remotely? It means you can trick people remotely, but it also means you can inspire people remotely. It also means that me and you can have this conversation right now on Skype. I'm not trying to trick you. I don't feel like you're trying to trick me.
Good,
right?
It's working.
Yeah, right. But I mean, like, this wouldn't have been possible otherwise, right? So, like, yeah, like, people do manipulate each other using internet tools, but people also do amazing things with internet tools, right? Like, Wikipedia is incredible. It's like a wonder of the modern world, right? Like, you wouldn't even believe that a peer-edited thing like that could exist if I came back 20 years ago and told you it would, right? Like, I think that because this is new and because we are inherently concerned about people trying to manipulate us, we sometimes, even though there are actual assholes trying to manipulate us, it's also easy to focus on that and miss some of the other things, just like sort of it bleeds, it leads in journalism, right? Like, you have these, the things that excite us are often things that do not represent a statistical average of reality. They represent the things that our biology is really finely tuned to pay the most attention to. So it's not that I'm not concerned about digital manipulation. Like, clearly people will keep doing it, and they're going to keep coming up with many clever new ways of doing it. But I am more or less equally concerned about that as I would be about in-person manipulation, right? Like, that's still the same thing happening. It's just people with different tools. So if I know that that's not the kind of world I want to live in, what I try to do is use the best tools at my disposal to create a world I do want to live in. So when I use social media, I don't try to trick people. I don't, for example, retweet people who are trying to manipulate others in order to provoke or make fun of them. Instead, I just completely ignore and block them. And I try to use social media to share things that I've learned about the world or things that inspire me about the world, and to have conversations exactly like this. And my hope is that by using it as like reasonable, mutually respectful people, we can turn the digital world into a place that is full of that, right? That doesn't, it's still going to have some of the nasty stuff, but it's going to have a lot of the good stuff.
That's a banner waving statement if I ever heard one. Eliot, I know you got to go, but before you do, I love asking people if they regard this recording as a sort of time capsule to be investigated by future historians and archaeologists. What is it that you hope that people in the time frame of your books are actually grappling with? Like, what is your sort of wish to the future listeners of this show that their lives are actually like? Presumably not constantly dealing with the unscalable email-esque threat of strangers trying to manipulate them, because that is the main difference, right, between the digital and the analog space, is that one person or a team of people can fuck with everybody. But,
yeah, although I mean, that's absolutely true of broadcast media as well, if not more so, right? Like, you want to look at a huge filter bubble, look at every network in the 1960s. Right? Like, geez, like we celebrate it because it was such a big filter bubble that everyone had no choice but to participate in it. Right? Which is, yeah. I mean, like, honestly, for folks, for all you future historians out there, first of all, we were trying to do our best and we're sorry. But I think that, like, there's this funny thing, and I find this when I'm writing these books that sort of extrapolate or imagine these possible futures, where yes, there's this world building, right? You're like thinking about how the world might be different, but at the same time, like, the things that really, really matter, like how you choose to spend the time you're lucky enough to have on this earth, right? Like whether you decide to try to trick people, as we were talking about before, or whether you try to live a life that eschews that in pursuit of something different and better, how much time you spend with the people you really care about, how you can, as a self, pursue selflessness, right? Like those things, I think, are very timeless, and they are the most important thing when I think about my own life. So when I'm writing a novel, I'm always trying to think not only what does this cool future look like and how might the world be different and what are some of these interesting questions, sort of philosophical questions we've been talking about during this interview, but also for the character involved, how do they realize some of those truths in their own lives, those truths that really are timeless, that would apply to your, great grandmother and your great granddaughter, right? Like that those things are the things that really matter. So I would just hope that those future historians, those listeners, remember that as well and try to learn those lessons even as we try to learn them today.
That's wonderful. And on that note, I'm going to release you to your scheduled vacation so that you can practice as you preach. Thanks so much for being on the show, Eliot.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Cheers.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the Mind Pod Network, which has a gorgeous, totally renovated new website and is home to over a dozen amazing podcasts, including Third Eye Drops, The Astral Hustle, Synchronicity, It's All Happening, and many more. Go to mindpodnetwork.com and check them out. Also, the featured sponsor for Future Fossils is Mike Schwab of knowyourmeme.com. For those of you unfamiliar with Know Your Meme, they're super aligned with the premise of this show that our contemporary culture may be one day of archaeological interest. Know Your Meme has countless pages and forum threads exploring the history and significance of web memes in both image and video. They were recently interviewed for a fabulous article on the history of the GIF. I highly recommend checking them out. And that's all for now. Thanks again for listening to Future Fossils, and have an excellent week.